Hello, welcome to the Viewpoint. I am Mamadou Mbouch. It is said that poets are the unacknowledged legislators of the world. It was actually said by P.B. Shelley, the English romantic poet. But here we will substitute writers for poets, and the argument will still hold. Their visions over time become cliché, but then it is politics that claims the prize. But what exactly is the role of the writer in society, in political life, particularly in our transition now? What does the world of literature make of our transitional goings on right now? Here to help me answer this and much more is the celebrated Gambian writer. He's the author of a brilliant trilogy. We can perhaps call it the Gambian trilogy, a la Aceh-based African trilogy. So, and he has also written so many articles. He's not only a writer, he's a literary and social critic. Mr. Barbasilla, welcome to the Viewpoint.
Thank you.
So before we get into things, as it happens, on the 8th of September, the day that we're recording this program, is World Literacy Day.
Yes, yes.
Fantastic, nice coincidence there. So first, your reflections on World Literacy Day.
Well, basically, Moro, I think literacy is a very important aspect of our society, of our history, of our past, present, and the future. Now, literature as it is a powerful tool for evolving, among other things, the distinctive spirit and ethos of a people within a given era in their history. Now, World Literacy Day is a significant event for all of us, in that personally as a writer, my reflections are that it is time to think about how we can promote literacy and literature. It is absolutely important, especially within the context of a society that is struggling with itself, trying to make meaning of itself, a people who have lost the best part of their own sense of history. I think it is up to literature to begin to point and to assess and reassess the situations, because it is a dynamic process and we need to address it every time a new phenomenon comes in, every time there's a new change. So this is why I think it is important that we embrace the day. We try to encourage people to begin to read. Now, one of the major problems in this society is that people are very, very self-opinionated, but they hardly read. You can ask one or two, you can do a survey and stop people on the road and ask them, when was the last time you read a book? How many books have you read? And the type of literature is also very, very important. Now, as a colonized people, what we need to do is to go back and look at where the rain began to beat us, as Achebe would say. And the rain began to beat us many, many centuries ago. And I think one of the major problems that political analysts, politicians, aspiring politicians make is that they're only looking at our society as is, instead of as it was several centuries ago.
Yeah, absolutely. And this brings me on, it dovetails onto the next point I wanted to ask. You've mentioned two words earlier, literature and history.
Yes.
What's the relationship between these two, I wonder?
There's a dialectical relationship between these two, and you cannot have one without the other. When we talk about literature, literature is really is caught up and enmeshed in everything we do, everything we have done in the past, and everything we plan to do in the future. Often we tend to limit literature to just the written word. No, literature extends beyond that. It is the songs that the women sing when they pound their millet. It is the work songs that the fishermen sing when they're trying to hold their catch. It is the song that the farmer in the field sings to inspire himself. And the historical aspect is every epoch in our history has a distinct and unique character, which literature needs to look at, needs to take along with it, so that we can have a perspective on what will happen in the future. So as I said, the two are it's a dialectical relationship. We cannot have one without the other.
So here it's literature then to inspire, because all the different contexts, the farmer, the woman, sometimes there could be songs of pain, other times of rejoice.
Exactly.
So you can have a whole spectrum, as it were, of feelings and emotions and that sort of thing. So what unifies all these different contexts in a literary sense?
In a literary sense, it is what is happening in and around them within a given time frame. I did not mention dance and the performing arts.
Yes.
They are also very much part of it. Something as simple as when I was younger, even the way the women walked had a name. The women did the ndak. Later on, the women did the checkers. And there are lots of other descriptions of the ways in which people express themselves. We are very expressive as a society. Even our art manifests itself in the way we dress, we speak, we dance, even to perform rituals. Now, a lot of things are changing now, but in the past, the way women dressed, for example, to attend ceremonies, they had headgears for different age groups. Like young girls did what they call the pahasao. And this was the hairdo that women used by weaving in cotton wool into the hair. The present day thing I see is the mesh. I'm not sure I'm so impressed about it, but yes. Anyway.
You're right.
Yeah, but going back, even the choice of chewing stick that the women used had to match the earrings that they had, the adornments that they had all around them. So every which way we look at it, there's an interconnection and there are intersections in which we can explore.
Absolutely. So here it seems as if literature, is it kind of a record of the historical changes over time? For instance, what you've told me about what used to happen, but now it isn't anymore. Is that the stuff of literature? History really is the canvas. To imagine a painter here. History is the canvas,
yes.
And then the literary person is the painter,
yes.
taken from history to tell us.
That's a very good analogy, excellent analogy. But the role of the writer really is to try and make sense out of the reality we live in, so that people can look at it from the perspective of literature, so that the poetry that comes out, for example, you hear poetry like Magat Midon Rod Nigali Raka Musan Nigile Point Gele Uyu. That's a significant poem, because here they're trying to show the didactic relationship between the young and the old, and how age really mattered for us in terms of respect, in terms of what elders can do. So here, even in poetry, it comes out in different forms. But as I said, the literary person's role is to try and explain this so that people can understand and imbibe what is existing around them or what had existed before.
Absolutely.
Yes.
And you've mentioned some, well, I've written down something, meaning. Earlier on, you said, you talked about how self-opinionated a lot of people are, yet they do not read. And then, really, for me to have any connection to my past, there must be some meaning, as it were, which I get from perhaps the stories I get from my grandparents or the books I read. But there must be meaning, some intellectual bridge, as it were. So here, what does that tell you about the kind of society we are in now? We hardly read, and everybody is just so self-opinionated. What does it tell you? How is it helping or hampering our transition process?
As I said at the beginning, let's go back to the beginning, how all of this started. It started all when formal education was introduced in our society. It came with a language that was alienating to begin with. And that language was English. My first sentence in English was John and Joan are going to the railway station. I mean, for the life of me, living in Bathurst then, I've never seen a railway. John and Joan are names that I could not relate to. And how could that help me understand and make meaning of what is being written and what I was learning? There are different aspects of it. You look at it. The history that was written from the perspective of Europeans. It was all about the wars that the Europeans and the Africans fought time and again, and wars that the Africans lost and the Europeans won. Now, then history, again, was written from the perspective of the conqueror. So that the curricula in schools reflected a hegemony that was established in this country, that was the hegemony of white supremacism, which we had imbibed. So it gave us an inferiority complex. And so that everything white was good, everything black was bad. So we begin to develop a mentality of self-loathing. We also could not relate to the literature that was given to us because the language was foreign. You see, Ngugi wa Thiong'o puts it very nicely. He says, because we are denied our languages, because of the circumstances that the colonial school has imposed upon us, they have imposed what he calls a cultural time bomb. And that cultural time bomb is simply this: we have lost our sense of self, we have lost our dignity, and the role of the writer and education and literature is to try and redo everything that was done in the past.
So here there was a almost, can I call it a clash between the traditional and this new colonial ways of doing things. And everything that you were learning, it was more Eurocentric. And perhaps I would like to think that then there was a counterpoise, a kind of Afrocentric counterpunch, as it were. Would you see yourself as a sort of Afrocentric writer?
Yes, I personally see myself as a post-colonial writer.
Post-colonial writer.
Yeah, Afrocentrism.
But is it Afrocentric?
Yes,
I wonder, it is Afrocentric.
Afrocentrism is a part of that.
Okay.
Okay. And the reason why I have done that, I have become this type of writer, is because I wanted us to look at ourselves, try to make meaning of our realities, try to think about the future and how we can move on. But as it is, we are in a state, we are entrapped and we are not moving. So in this state of confusion, someone somewhere has to begin to say, okay, let's look at the issue again. Obviously, maybe the model that we have adopted is wrong. And for me, the reason why I call myself post-colonial writer is because I don't believe for once that ever since the Union Jack was lowered and the Gambian flag was hoisted in 1965, nothing has changed. Signboards may have changed, but the neo-colonial situation remains. And the contradictions that are embedded within that still remain. Rural-urban dichotomy.
But isn't that a longer-term project?
Yes, it will have to be a long-term project. Everybody, the leadership, must be able to create those conditions in which we as a people can begin to see ourselves within our own context and see what is wrong and what we can do about it.
Yes, but just before we get into that, yes. I just want to play devil's advocate here
yes.
a bit. Afrocentrism and Eurocentrism, to my mind, the same conceptual fallacy, the same problem with Eurocentrism, isn't it in Afrocentrism? Isn't it a particular way of thinking that is narrow and perhaps doesn't quite represent any complex circumstance?
Afrocentrism really emerged out of the fact that, in fact, the best part of it came from the United States
yes.
and Europe, where the situation was really rife and stark for the black person. Nothing has changed under the sun since then. But Afrocentrism was sort of reactive. It was a way in which people are trying to react to the circumstances they were caught up in. And it, of course, included the literature that was written, the way that people looked to try to connect with a past that they had lost. So Afrocentrism really, I think, emerged out of that context.
Absolutely.
But it is not necessarily a negative thing. But as I said, where its origins, there was a reason why that happened. They were a people whose tongues were taken away. They had lost their languages. They had lost their families. They've been taken across the Middle Passage. And their identity was also stolen. So I can understand and I can relate to that very well, to Afrocentrism in that regard. But where Afrocentrism begins to be reduced to cultural nationalism as what obtains here in Africa, then I say no thanks.
So what do I call it, the limitations of Afrocentrism?
Yes, there are limitations of Afrocentrism, but I see that some brothers and sisters in the diaspora are acknowledging it and are moving on from there. What is going to emerge out of it and whatever nomenclature they gave it, I don't quite know as yet, but we'll see. what happens in the next few years.
Absolutely. Earlier on, you mentioned James Ngugi,
Yes.
writer of Petals of Blood and Grain of It and the like. I think he was called James Ngugi, wasn't he? And afterwards, he changed his name to Ngugi wa Thiong'o.
Exactly.
Absolutely. So the curious thing here, I want to bring a contrast, for instance, between Ngugi in Kenya and modern-day Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie.
Of Nigeria.
And with Ngugi left English and started writing in Kikuyu. But again, Chimamanda said she doesn't feel any alienation with English language. Is this the generational gap? I mean, what's going on here? Here is really an equally talented writer, but the feelings, the perspective is quite different. There's an interesting movement there in the literary evolution of some of these African writers.
Yes. Yes. I'm sort of caught up in between the two, but because I think in part it is ideological, and if it comes to that, I am siding with Ngugi.
You're siding with Ngugi?
Yes, yes.
Okay.
Chimamanda.
Are you like the classical view and now the romantic view?
Well, there you've got it. You've got it. But I want to say that I have a lot of sympathy for Ngugi, although 2 weeks ago I was on this conference where he's talking about the African literature and African Renaissance. Okay, Ngugi is interesting in many respects. He's saying that when we write and read in other people's languages, then there's something that we miss. I think to a certain extent he's right, because I think in Wolof, sometimes in Mandinka, and I write in English. So which is why if you look at my writing, I had made sure that to every concept or phenomenon that is alien to us, I try to find an equivalent in our culture.
But do we really think in language? I've heard certain psychologists, for instance, the former MIT man Steven Pinker, saying that possibly humans think in what he called mentalese. There's a kind of mental language, perhaps we use visual or auditory images, or even abstract propositions, stuff like that. Because after all, babies, before they get language, they learn to make a sense of the world before they acquire language. That is some kind of thought.
Yes.
So do we really think in language? What is the significance of language in a culture, apart from simply to communicate?
Okay.
I wonder.
Okay, let me go back to your initial thing.
Yes.
I personally subscribe to the view of a psychologist called Labov. Now, he's saying there's a relationship between language and thinking. And it is the same way that a psychologist called Jerome Bruner, he talks about us thinking in terms of icons. But I want to go back to Labov, who says that there's a relationship between language and thinking, because language helps thinking. And thinking helps language to organize itself so that it can articulate these symbols that we think through. You can call it whatever. You call it, what did you say the man called it?
Which one?
The guy you just quoted.
Pinker.
Pinker.
Yes, mentalese.
Yes,
mentalese, yes.
Mental symbols. Other thinkers like Piaget.
Yes, Piaget, the Swiss child psychologist.
Exactly.
Yes.
Piaget presents a view where you develop an image. Like, for instance, you have a little dog that comes. You know about dogs. Okay, so when you see a donkey, you say, there's a big dog. So later on, he calls it, when you see the dog, you accommodate the image of a dog, and then later you assimilate it within your own system, so that every time you see something with 4 legs, 2 big ears, you call it a dog. It is later on that you begin to decipher what is a dog and what is a donkey. So,
and even within dogs, you have the different breeds of dogs.
Exactly, and it goes
even
on and on.
within.
It goes on and on and on.
It goes on and on and on and on and on.
Okay.
But this is it. Maybe the point really I'm trying to get to is that are we sort of entirely, if you like, at the mercy of language, or rather, I can take language and then through imagination, I subvert it. That's how we create revolutions in many ways.
Yes.
I can assimilate it, and then when I regurgitate, it's never going to be the same because there was something there in me already. So the regurgitation would always be slightly different. So in a sense, I am making it my own. This was a similar argument made by Henry Louis Gates of Harvard in one of his books. So when I take it in, I turn it into my own. So that alienation, I'm not sure how long it will last.
Yeah, but a lot of it too, you see, language is also wrapped up with emotions. How we feel about the phenomenon that we're trying to describe or trying to talk about. So if the stimuli, for example, makes me angry, then my reaction to that, in a verbal language sense, would be a counterbalance with a verbal symbol that is aggressive. So there are lots of things. You see, the thing with psychology is that the more you get into it, the more you see the connections within you, within yourself, and between your biology and your cognition and the reality that you live in.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so these are issues that are quite interesting that can be taken up on a different subject.
Absolutely, and the problem for me, particularly with psychology, it tries to study the mind, but the mind is not an organ. You cannot see it. So it's a remarkable study in that sense. It's not like brain science. There's a brain there, you know, you can look at.
Yes.
But again, there's something called the mind, and you really cannot see it. So I think we've got a nice background of concepts.
Exactly.
Now we get into your books.
Yes.
I think the first one you published, was it the Monkey Talks?
When the Monkey Talks.
Huh?
When the Monkey Talks.
When the Monkey Talks?
Yes.
Was it 2005?
2002, I think.
Something
somewhere
like that. Well,
yes,
some of my sources there now.
It has been republished.
Yes. Yes. So tell us a bit about your When the Monkey Talks. This is the first of your trilogy.
Exactly.
So it reminded me of a bit of Chinua Achebe, Things Fall Apart, No Longer at Ease, and Other of God.
Yes.
That kind of trilogy, giving us a nice narrative.
Yes.
Was it similarly patterned?
Yes.
Were you thinking along those lines?
Absolutely.
All right.
What happened was I had planned to rewrite our history because I did not like the way it was presented. It was sort of skewed and cockeyed. And we also adopted this thing about history being facts and dates. And we stripped them off their situational context so that it was impossible to find the forward and backward linkages. Now, but then as it happens, owing to a concatenation of circumstances, one of which is that I lost my sight about 22 years ago, 23 years ago. And then when I recovered from that, I asked myself again, is this really what you want to do? Are people going to read this history? I said no. Okay, now what I want to do is I want to juxtapose history and literature so that whatever I write, I want it to be easily assimilable. I also want it to relate to what has happened so that I can begin charting our history from 1880. So when the Monkey Talk started in 1880, when Africa was partitioned, when Gambia became Gambia, Senegal became Gambia. Can you imagine the arrogance?
That's the Berlin Conference you're talking about.
At the Berlin Conference.
Yes.
Not a single African was present, and they sat down with a ruler and pencil and drew out all the boundaries. And each one of them took their share of the cake. Just like King Leopold of Belgium said,
absolutely.
This is my magnificent cake, the Congo. That area, the Congo itself, is bigger than Europe, Western Europe. Can you imagine?
Absolutely. And we understand that Bismarck organized the Berlin Conference really to placate that Belgian monster, really King Leopold,
exactly.
utter monster.
Yes,
absolutely,
exactly.
You're right.
And then at the time too, Europeans were falling over each other in the continent. Each one of them trying to get their piece of cake. But the other thing that also crystallized this, that Berlin Conference, was that they wanted to develop each one of their own spheres of influence. And they used language. Anglophone, Francophone, Lusophone, and all the bigophones that they have created to divide and rule us. And these boundaries didn't regard people's burial sites, their culture. They didn't care what happened. So they just took a pencil and paper and then decided on how the history of Africa has to be charted from then on. Okay, this is why I started my writing from there. And the most important thing is that they had imposed what is called a cash crop economy on Africans, and we accepted it. Of course, with a lot of resistance, but we were forced into growing groundnuts. Groundnut was not native here. But we were made to grow groundnuts because the industries at Merseyside in Britain needed to make soap, to make shampoo, and all the products that can be made out of peanuts.
So your book essentially was, well, I wouldn't ask who the monkey
We'll
is.
get there.
So when the monkey talks,
Yes.
so the consequences of that.
Yes.
Is that what it captures?
Yes, but the consequences of that is, towards the interesting part of that history is that from our ranks rose an interesting nationalist called Edward Francis Small. Now, who stood up and said, no, this ain't right. We got to put a stop to this. And what he said was he tried to awaken people's sensibilities. He tried to say, challenge every single piece of legislation that was penned for our future in the Gambia. He challenged every single one of them. So in the end, the significance of when the monkey talks is, the Aku say, when monkey talk, monkey yeri. Right? So in this instance, the monkeys did not yeri. And this is what happened. This is what has landed us into this situation. We didn't listen. We didn't listen to what he was saying. You see? So in the end, again too, due to the divisiveness of colonization, they were able to split our ranks. And because Small set up the trade unions, then they were able to get other people to come and set up trade unions and counter him. He was able to get the Aku gentry to rise and oppose Small, even though they were supporters of Small. So in the end, this was why Small died a pauper, friendless, and he died penniless.
Absolutely, and he was the one who initiated trade unionism, that political awakening. In fact, the first person, isn't it, to be voted into the Legislative Council in the colony, in Bathurst.
Yes, he was voted in after Wilfred Davidson Carroll died.
After that's it.
Yes, but before they had chosen, they were choosing their people. So it was Small that pushed for what is called the elective principle. He's saying, hang on, this doesn't happen in Britain, why should it happen here? People are voted into the municipalities. Yes. Why don't we do that?
So that's what you've taken, and you've sort of turned it into a kind of history as a literary narrative.
Yes, exactly. That's the point.
That's the point of when the monkey this is it. And
yes.
When the monkey talks, the novel spans, what, 70 years?
70 years.
So from the 1880s Berlin Conference, obviously it will cover the First World War, 1914,
exactly.
1918.
Yes.
And then it moves on until the second tranche.
Exactly. So it came to 1940.
Yes. And that's where you have your second
exactly.
book.
Yes.
Dabaligi.
Dabaligi.
Let's go into that a bit. How does it move on the narrative?
The narrative moves into an era of our history where, because of a stalemate in Europe, because of fascism, the rise of fascism, and for the so-called free world to counter fascism, they drag us all out from their colonies to go and fight a war that did not belong to us. We were not part of that war. We had nothing to do with it. But they took us and pushed us into the killing fields of the Arakan and the Kaladan.
And they will say that we were part of the empire.
Yes.
We were conquered.
Yes.
We were part of the empire.
We were part of the empire. And then to drag us there, they made promissory notes. We will do this and this and this and this. All these promissory notes. In fact, in the end, they were able to convince the village alcalos all throughout the country to mobilize the youth to go and fight this war. But what I try to do in that book is based on three parallel narratives. The first narrative is about the people that went to the war. The second narrative was about the vicissitudes of the people that they left behind, their wives, their children, their mothers, relations they left behind. And the third parallel narrative there is the emerging geopolitics, the rise of African nationalism.
Absolutely.
Yes, so Dabaligi takes on from there, 1940, and it goes on to 1950.
Absolutely. Then we have the Dreams of the Island.
Dreams of the Island.
This is where the fact that they renege on the promissory note, as you put it, this is where it will play out in many ways, and then galvanize that whole independence movement in many ways.
Absolutely. Yeah. You've got it right. And this is where politics then moved out of all the polite drawing rooms and it went to the clamor of the streets. Because of the production system that they imposed on us, the youth in the rural areas migrated to the urban area because of the contradictions of colony and protectorate. The distribution of resources were never even. It was located here. And what you had in the rural areas is, as I described in that book, is that all the roads that they built led to the roads and the railways right to the sea. And when it got to the sea, the goods that were produced from the countryside came to the city and followed the sea lanes to Europe. And nothing much came back.
Absolutely. But it will be interesting. Let's just move it on a bit. Yeah. So all of these three books were set in sort of pre-independence Gambia. It will be interesting to contrast that with the sort of stuff that happened in post-independence, because at independence perhaps we thought that, okay, good, these colonialists, they're gone, they were the problem. Now that we've got self-governance, then you will see something better. But again, The cunning of history. Quite interesting. History had something hidden from us, which exposed itself afterwards. What did you make of that?
Well, it's simply this. I had said it earlier on. We adopted a neo-colonial state and used a neo-colonial model and pushed it and didn't even try to see what is right or what is wrong. We just swallowed it, hook, line, and sinker, and took it lock, stock, and barrel.
Could we have done it any differently, just given the history, given that we were sort of locked in a certain logic of circumstance? Could we have done it any differently, given that generally liberation, self-government is really a long-term project?
Absolutely. Yeah, you see, we had a great opportunity in Addis Ababa when all the African leaders were. And there were several visions of Africa. The vision of Africa that actually held was the vision of those that will continue business as usual.
The gradualists.
Yes.
We're talking here about, was it the Casablanca group
and the Monrovian
group, that sort of thing,
the
and the radicals.
Yes.
But what was realistic at the time? I mean, I've read your interview with the former president, Sadara Keita,
yes.
And I think you touched on this as well.
Yeah,
and just as he said, really, the Nkrumah Casablanca ticket, as it were, was just a bit too radical. There wasn't, you couldn't really implement it. It wasn't feasible at the time.
Yes, it was. He was wrong.
You reckon he was wrong?
Yes, I think he was wrong because you see, when Africans got together, African leaders got together, as I said, the Nkrumah's vision of Africa is the unitary continental Africa, so that they will have a continental unitary government, just like what happens in the States, right? A federal state where there are different countries. But the important thing was, what was missing was that it is possible for us Africans at the time to begin to look at how we can complement each other's economies rather than continuing to export cash crops.
But
from here?
Wouldn't you say that Africa, we were too various? There was an assumption that maybe we were talking about one people, but isn't that really the language of the colonialists? It was the colonialists who refused to see differences, but we knew that we had differences, obviously, given the different languages. Even in small Gambia, my mother spoke to me Wolof, somebody else's mother spoke to them in Mandinka, Okula. So we knew that there were certain differences, but again, there's some people call it the myth of oneness. And now we are really living the difficulties of this sort of perhaps misconceptualization of what we are. We are far more varied than we are allowed to think.
Yeah, but you see the consequences of colonization is what we're living with now. The problem is not the differences among us. The problem is the system of production and distribution of resources that is the problem.
Yes, that's straight out of Marx, it seems.
Yes, let us begin to look at that. Let us begin to look at that. Let us begin to look at like what Small was doing.
But in your writing, this is quite interesting that you've mentioned it.
Yes.
Absolutely. But again, when we talk about Africa and that sort of thing, we don't bring class into it. Whereas in Marx's and topology, class was really very important to it. But somehow in our analysis, we don't tend to do that. Yet, you know that human beings socially, we tend to stratify ourselves. I mean, whether writers want to write about it or not, ordinary people, that's how they talk about themselves and their neighbors and that sort of thing.
You see, there's the elite. There's the elite, and that constitutes the political class, right? And it is this political class that is manipulating everything to its own interest. And of course, this political class is in cahoots with international finance capital. So that any society, any country in Africa that begins to look at other developmental models, the finance capital and the governments in Europe and America will send in and instigators, and then the military coups take place. You know, the reason why we have all these military coups in Africa is because they are actually instigated by the countries of the West. There's no doubt about that. If they don't like you, it's because you've made utterances. Look at the history.
That is certainly true. I mean, we've got this well documented, isn't it? A lot of coups that happen here, yes. CIA involvement
exactly.
or something. But there's something underlying that. What allows them to do that is because we are not united in the first place. There was something there that really, well, did it fragment things, or is it that we were never one anyway in the first place, and perhaps that historical journey, that historical move that needed to happen, and gradually perhaps you would have seen what you're seeing today, perhaps in the EU. But that organic, can one call it that? That organic evolution of societies was truncated, was stopped.
Exactly.
At a certain point, really.
Yeah.
So this was a complex reality.
Very
so
complex.
The romance of independence
it gone.
really
Fizzled
collapsed
out. Fizzled out.
on the rocks of reality,
Yes.
one can call it that.
Yeah, that romance fizzled out. But the important thing is the neo-colonial state, when it emerged, it was never neutral and it was extremely weak. Which
When
allowed,
you say it was never neutral.
it was never neutral.
So there were, what do you mean by that?
It was never neutral. Neutral in the sense that it reflected the aspirations of everybody. You look at them, you look at all the states, they were all dominated by one ethnic group based on an electoral system of winner takes all. So that the numbers was what mattered, not in terms of social and political what's the word I'm looking for? Equity.
Solidarity, equity?
Yes. That never happened. Then the other thing was the institutions that were established became even weaker. And then they continued with this rural-urban dichotomy. And then democracy, as it was peddled to us, meant political democracy, not social democracy. In our law books, in our statute books, yes, it might say that we all da-da-da-da-da-da.
So what would you say? Political democracy, how is it different from social democracy, for instance?
Well, political democracy is democracy that exists in the statute books.
All right.
We have a constitution that says this, that, and the other. But in actual fact, when you go down to the street, those people don't even know what they're doing in the houses of parliament. So that process of alienation has actually created more harm than good. Because in the end, people were so disgruntled and so dissatisfied with the order as it is, they wouldn't change and change at any price. And this is how we ended up with dictatorial regimes. Because they came to begin with and speak about the grievances that we all were airing out.
But isn't it also partly because the euphoria that was generated during the campaign, during the crusade, you know, the fight, the battle to get independence? Let me just give you just a quick thing that I listened to some years back. The 1945 Pan-African Conference in Manchester. When I lived in Britain some years ago, I sort of happened to sort of just tune into Radio 4, and they were playing the transcript. It was all dramatized. And the fascinating thing was that William Du Bois, the great Du Bois, was there. And I remember this line distinctly, quite haunting, saying to the African leaders, potentially, you had Jomo Kenyatta was there, this was before they became presidents, and all future presidents. The whole place was full of future presidents. He said to them, you want your independence, but you haven't ruled yourself for a very long time. It will be extremely difficult. It was quite ominous, to my mind, but when you, afterwards, when you look at the literature, the euphoria, everybody thought that things were going to be sorted, but it's never that simple.
No.
Perhaps we must go back to the drawing board.
To the beginning, as
to
I
the
said.
beginning, all the ideas, the writers, what they were saying before, they were also perhaps intoxicated by that euphoric, you know, we want independence. But now we are beginning to see that life is not a romance.
It's a reality that we live.
So the writers contributed a lot to that.
Yes. And the political class also at the time were very good at misleading people with all the placards they flagged around. Independence now, not today. Ghana today, Gambia tomorrow. And it went all over Africa.
Absolutely.
Amandla. All those slogans, we want bread and butter. All those slogans were folded up and pushed on the beds after independence came.
Yes. All the sloganeering. So this is it. Finally, we're coming towards the end. I think it was Bertrand Russell, the great English philosopher, who once remarked that people, when we analyze politics, we take insufficient account of psychology into it. Because so far, in Africa, post-independence Africa, we've been talking about economic development and all sorts of things. We want to advance, we want to do all sorts of things. But perhaps we had not done the basic work, engage honestly with the self psychologically. When you put anybody in public positions, they think about themselves and not the national good. Even Wole Soyinka once questioned whether there is a sense of nationhood. Whatever there is a psychological issue that perhaps if we do not take care of, then a lot of things are not going well, and we should be able, having the courage to call a spade a spade.
Correct.
In many ways. Yes, what do you think, the duty of the writer in the future?
Well, the writer must fight the prevailing mentality. That's to begin with. There's a psychology that comes with underdevelopment. I think the role of the writer is to begin to highlight issues of a developmental nature. We begin to start by looking, first of all, at our own minds to begin with. That's important. So that we can begin to see ourselves as human beings and not appendages or subhumans. We begin to assert ourselves and reclaim our dignity, reclaim the mantle of a past that we have lost. And our people must also begin to look at alternative ways of doing things. We've done the same things over and over again, repeatedly in the same way. How about looking at other alternative ways of looking at things? Like there are, for example, indigenous ways of looking at things. There are ways in which our education system can be restructured so that it speaks to our economic development. If there's a mismatch, forget it. The most important part of a people's development is the people's education. And that the people's education is a part of what is predicated on, among other three things. We must build strong, resilient institutions. We must try to help the organizations to flourish so that we as a people can see that the gas that is flared in Nigeria alone is enough to put electricity in every single home in West Africa. Absolutely. Education system, sorry?
Yes, absolutely. We've sort of come to the end. Yes, I mean, the writers must really re-steer the narrative,
Okay.
isn't it? Essentially, that's really where we're heading.
Yes.
Now, things are really very serious, particularly with this COVID-19. We know that when disasters come, when you don't have good institutions, when you're not ready for it, then you're going to pay the price. Well, you've got your work cut out for you. And the younger generation, of course, we are all getting on, but particularly with the younger generation.
True, true.
Thank you very much, Mr. Babasila. That was an enlightening, profound,
Thank you.
very profound discussions there.
Thank you.
I really appreciate that.
Yes.
And thank you very much, our viewers. You've been watching the Veiwpoint. I am Mamadou Mbouch. Until next time, goodbye. Stay safe.